Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're unpacking a really fascinating and highly debated framework presented in a recent source. The creator of this material dives deep into evolutionary psychology, human history, and relationship dynamics to completely challenge the modern status quo of marriage. Now, we aren't here to take sides. Instead, we're going to objectively break down the exact mechanics of their argument so you can thoroughly understand the logic they use to arrive at their conclusions.
Right off the bat, the source hooks us with a massively provocative question. Why polygyny? The speaker is straight up asserting that traditional, lifelong monogamy between one man and one woman might not be the ultimate or even the most natural answer for human society. To understand how they get to this bold claim, we have to look at the foundational steps of their argument.
So to really get where the creator is coming from, we're going to deconstruct their thesis chronologically. First, evolutionary building blocks. Second, the technology disruption. Third, genetics, survival, and hypergamy. And finally, the societal case for polygyny. Let's jump in.
All right, part one, evolutionary building blocks. This is all about the origins of marriage, at least according to the source's biological perspective. The creator argues that early marriage, it had absolutely nothing to do with modern romance. It was strictly about survival, built on three very practical steps. Step one was just procreation, the raw drive to propagate the species. But just making babies isn't enough. They have to actually survive to adulthood. So that brings us to step two, emotional connection. The speaker says this emotion evolved literally just to keep couples together long enough to raise independent kids, which leads us directly to the third crucial element, propriety.
Now, the source defines propriety as a man's historical assertion that a woman belongs to him, and they frame this as an absolutely crucial, non-negotiable survival mechanism. The idea here is that a man's natural jealousy ensured exclusivity, which ultimately guaranteed his paternity. If he knew for sure the kids were his, he'd willingly take on the massive responsibility of providing for them. Plus, the source points out that historically, this exclusivity basically prevented disease by cutting out what they call sexual communism.
Moving right along to Section 2, the technology disruption. Here's where we see how those ancient building blocks get completely turned upside down by modern innovation.
Think about the sheer contrast between our distant past and our present reality. Back in the day, with no luxury of DNA tests, sex naturally carried a huge likelihood of pregnancy. Natural exclusivity was basically forced on us by biology. But today, we have modern birth control. The source makes the case that this technology completely severed the natural consequences of sex. Women gained sexual freedom without the constant risk of pregnancy, and men could engage without the risk of suddenly having to raise a child. According to the speaker, this single technological leap totally dismantled the traditional building blocks of marriage that kept humanity structured for millennia.
Which brings us to Section 3, genetics, survival, and hypergamy. This is really the biological core of their argument, attempting to justify relationship hierarchies entirely through genetic survival.
The source paints a picture of early human survival that is intensely vulnerable. Think about human prehistory for a second. During pregnancy, a woman was naturally physically disadvantaged. Then, for at least 2 years after birth, the infant requires constant nursing and intensive care. Because of this extreme vulnerability window, a mother literally had to rely entirely on a strong male provider to secure food and protection. To explain exactly how women survive this timeline, the source uses the term hypergamy. They define it as a woman's natural inclination to attach herself to the absolute strongest male provider available, even if he already has other females. The crucial takeaway here is that, historically, a woman would deliberately choose to share a single high-value, physically strong guy to guarantee her child's survival, rather than settle for a weaker man who couldn't step up during those vulnerable nursing years.
So the creator argues that nature used this exact setup to rigorously filter out weak genes. The strongest males secured the most women, naturally passing those strong physical genes on to the next generation. But what about the guys who lost out? Well, the source makes this really fascinating claim. Weaker men were basically forced to develop brains over brawn. They had to invent technology, build civilization, and secure huge amounts of wealth just to level the playing field and compete for women.
Finally, we hit Section 4, the societal case for polygyny. This is where the source completely shifts away from the history lesson and prescribes a specific framework for us today. The speaker has a very blunt view of our current reality. They argue that high-value men are actually already siring children with multiple women covertly, whether society wants to acknowledge it or not. The core premise here is that this is just a biological fact.
It's happening all around us, and deliberately burying our heads in the sand about it is actively doing societal damage.
So they present a stark cost-benefit analysis. On one side, you've got our current system of covert illicit relationships. The result? Accidental children outside wedlock, kids suffering from a lack of fatherly connection, and women who eventually lose the ability to pair bond. But on the flip side, their proposed solution is regulated open polygyny. In that framework, men actually lay claim to and take full responsibility for all their kids. This establishes legitimate fatherly connections and, according to the source, provides women with highly stable, structured married lives.
It all boils down to this one major quote from the source material. Society might as well embrace the reality and ride that wave in a more realistic and feasible and functional fashion. It's an uncompromising look at human nature. The creator is urging society to stop fighting human biology, arguing that formally regulating these ingrained urges through legitimate polygyny actively restores the accountability that covert affairs completely destroy. So, we're going to leave you with this final thought to chew on. Does regulating these historical biological urges actually solve our complex modern problems, just like the source suggests? Or does this entire framework completely ignore the fact that human civilization, ethics, and partnership have evolved way beyond basic genetic survival? We've mapped out the creator's entire argument for you today. Now it's up to you to evaluate their underlying logic. Thanks for hanging out with me on this explainer, and remember to keep questioning the frameworks around you.